Welcome to Cures and Capital, the podcast on value creation in biotech and pharma. I am Simon.
I'm Martin.
And today we are joined by Jason O'Neill, former CEO of Dendreon and Iridium Therapeutics, and the author of the newly published The Secrets of Successful Drug Launches.
Similar to his new book, this episode is going to be a guide for successful drug launches. We will cover what separates the winners from the failures. We will go over common pitfalls and strategies to turn the odds to your favor. We will also discuss how early do you need to start thinking about commercialization of your drug and the importance of meaningful relative advantage.
From psychology, life cycle planning to pre-mortem exercises with your launch team, this episode is packed with hard-earned wisdom from Jason. Today's episode is a must-listen for anyone thinking about launching a drug, especially if you have little to no commercial experience.
After the interview with Jason, Simon and I go over our reflections and takeaways, and as always, all views and opinions expressed in this podcast are our own and do not represent that of our employers.
Since we had a lot of ground to cover in this conversation, we ended up making it a two-part episode, and this is part one, where we lay the groundwork and cover the essential considerations during early development. Now, please welcome Jason O'Neill.
So welcome, Jason. Welcome to our podcast.
Thanks, guys. Nice to be here.
We are looking forward to the conversation, but maybe before we kick in, would you give our listeners a little bit of overview of your bio?
Yeah, sure. I'm the former Chief Executive Officer of Dendreon Pharmaceuticals and Iridium Therapeutics. Prior to those roles, I served in general management positions at Sanofi, Genentech, and Mallinckrodt Pharmaceuticals. I've also served as a global therapeutic area head for immunology and ophthalmology at Roche. And in that role, I oversaw the phase 3 development and global commercialization of a diverse array of assets in categories ranging from rheumatoid arthritis and lupus to wet age-related macular degeneration. Earlier in my career, I served as a vice president of U.S. marketing, Asia-Pacific marketing, and global marketing at some of the same companies mentioned previously. And over the course of my career, I played a primary role in 8 new product launches, 2 of which set category records for first-year sales, and an additional 5 that unfortunately didn't make it to market. So I look forward to sharing some experiences from some of those successes and failures in our call today.
That's why we are here today. So we are looking forward to that. But maybe one obvious question, and that is, what attracted you to launching new drugs?
You know, new product launches are really, I would say, high-risk, high-reward assignments. They really demand people with a very high level of urgency and also, I think, a lot of stamina. They're also terrific learning opportunities. You really get a bird's eye view of, I think, the root causes of success and failure in our industry and also how those root causes can shift depending on the product and the situation. So if you like to learn, there's really no better place to be. And the other thing I've found is that new product launches tend to attract some of the best people in every company. So it gives you an opportunity to kind of rub elbows with and learn from and be challenged by some of the best people you're likely to meet in your career. So collectively, I think once you've had a chance to work in a new product launch, it's really all you ever want to do.
So you don't feel like trying something else. This is the place for you.
No, I think if you've kind of sailed a ship in some stormy seas, being a captain of a very calm ship is not so exciting anymore, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. But before we go into why we are here, and that is to learn something about the secrets of successful drug launches, you recently wrote a book. And I mean, of course, as you gave in your bio, you have a very rich experience in drug launches, and you wrote a book, try to summarize all your experience into that. But there's a cause behind your book. You're trying to support a certain cause with the proceeds of that book. Could you tell us something more about it?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks, Martin, for the ability to give my shameless pitch here. But 100% of the proceeds of the book are going to the Prostate Cancer Foundation in memory of my dad who lost his battle with prostate cancer back in 2016. So readers will be gaining valuable knowledge while supporting a worthy cause. Prostate cancer is a very slow-growing cancer, so early detection results in 5-year survival rates that are pretty close to 100%. So we're hoping to raise a lot of funds to really invest in screening and achieving some outcomes like that. I'm very grateful to both of you for buying the book and reading it. I'm hopeful that we can have a really engaging conversation today and convince a few more people to purchase the book as well. So thanks again for the opportunity to be on today and to promote the book.
I'm sure it will be a great talk. And I mean, for listeners out there, it's a win-win scenario, right? You can learn something and also support a good cause. There's no better way to learn than this. But let's go into the conversation then. And let's start all the way at the beginning and let's make it practical. Your book is almost a guide. So let's try to make the interview also a guide for the listeners, for the companies out there, how to actually launch a drug successfully. So let's suppose that I'm a biotech CEO and we have a company here, and let's say, for the sake of it, that we have little to no commercialization experience, because as you also mentioned in your book, the companies with little to no commercialization experience, they are actually going to be leading the new drug launches over the next decade. So it is also a fairly relevant factor. To frame why this is an important topic to pay attention to, in your book, you point out that up to 66% of launches fail to meet expectations. Could you tell us why is launching new drugs so challenging and what's at stake for biotech companies out there?
Sure. Well, let me first comment that I think you're right, Martin, that more than half of the projected blockbusters over the next 5 years are expected to be launched by first-time launchers. So I think this is a trend that's likely to continue. But whether you're an experienced company or a first-time launcher, the primary reason I think that so many new product launches fail is that the customers we're appealing to, the prescribers out there, tend to overvalue the benefits of the products they're currently working with, and they tend to undervalue the benefits of the products that they could be working with. We're all very familiar with many of the traditional costs associated with behavior change, and they are things like transaction costs and learning costs and obsolescence costs in some cases. But I think what we're less familiar with are some of the psychological costs associated with behavior change, and these are far more important determinants of new product and service adoption. The heuristics at play here are the endowment effect and the status quo bias, and they lead customers to overvalue the benefits of products they currently possess over ones they could readily acquire. And it works this way because people have a tendency to be overly influenced by losses relative to similar sized gains, a concept that we refer to as loss aversion. And in his landmark experiments on this subject, Nobel laureate Richard Thaler separated subjects into two groups, usually sellers and buyers. And he would give the sellers an object. And in one example, he gave them a coffee cup. And then he asked them, shortly after giving them that coffee cup, to set a price they'd be willing to sell it for. With the buyers, he asked them to set a bidding price for which they'd be willing to buy that coffee cup. And in a rational world, you would expect the prices set by sellers and buyers to be pretty similar. But that wasn't the case. The price on average that sellers set was over $7. And the price that buyers or bidders set was under $3. It was a surprising finding. And so they conducted the experiment over and over again with different products and different scenarios and situations, but always with similar results. The sellers always demanded at least twice as much compensation to give up products they already possessed than they were willing to pay to obtain these products in the first place. So this was an incredibly important finding as it relates to companies trying to bring products to market, because essentially your prospects undervalue the products you're bringing. And in the past, when I was in, let's say, the earlier stages of my career and I was maybe selling products, if I had a 20% advantage, I thought it was great. It was a really big deal and I was going to go out there and make a lot of hay with it. But in reality, the magnitude of benefit has to be much greater if we really hope to penetrate. And I think the implications for the industry are that if we look at the US market alone, over the past 5 years, the FDA has approved an average of 49 drugs, which is an improvement over the prior decades, but it's still a pretty small number. And we've got over 350 companies actively marketing products in the US market, another 1,000 to 2,000 that are actively developing drugs that are hopefully going to make their way into the U.S. market. So that's a lot of people developing and not a lot of products making it to market. So these are really rare and precious assets. And we've got a very high failure rate. And it's not like when we fail, we can just reach back into the cupboard and grab another product and go launch it. It could be 5 to 10 years before your company has another new product launch. So the stakes are high. The number of assets is precious and rare. And I think we've got to do a better job of sort of improving our batting average here if we hope to accelerate growth in the industry.
And I think now, as you said, right, if you fail launching your first product, then you have to wait for the next one. And I think there is an important or interesting dynamic there is that not only it is hard to launch a product, but it almost seems like if you underperform in year one, you almost cannot catch up, right? So it's kind of make or break. Could you tell us a little bit about this dynamic as well?
That's a really, really important point, Martin. The research is really pretty definitive here. I think the overwhelming majority of products that fail to achieve their consensus analyst estimates in year one go on to underachieve their estimates in years 2 and year 3. And I think the implication for companies is that launches are really all or nothing ventures. You've really got to put everything you possibly have behind it because you rarely get a second chance to make a good first impression. And this dynamic is particularly important, I think, for first-time launchers because they have a tendency to sort of piecemeal their pre-launch commercial investments while doubling down on their clinical investments. They approach the market really underprepared and they routinely get punished by the marketplace. And this is one of the reasons why their overall commercialization success rate for first-time launchers is significantly lower than it is for more experienced companies with, 15 or more launches under their belt.
Absolutely. And I think you actually set it out very nicely. I think now we set the scene. It is not at all easy to launch a drug. It's actually very challenging. But now the reason why we have you here is let's now give our listeners a guide on how to then do it well with all your your experience. So let's jump straight into it. So now we have this fictional biotech company, right? Or a company with little to no launching experience. To maximize our chances of success, at what stage of drug development should I actually start considering commercialization? I assume that starting right after filing might not be the winning formula.
Yeah, I agree with your assumption. It's far too late. Commercialization needs to be a primary consideration really in the design of your phase 2 studies. And that time point is particularly important because your phase 2 trial is your proof of concept study. And when you have a successful phase 2 trial, you typically will replicate that phase 2 study in phase 3 on a larger scale, but you try your best not to change too many of the primary endpoints in those studies. And the reason for that is that you want to increase the probability of success in phase 3 because that in turn increases the overall value of the project, the value of the asset. And if you're a company that's just developing assets, you want that to be as valuable as it possibly can be. So you want as little change as possible at that time. So it just places increased emphasis on getting your phase 2 trial design right. And one of the problems that even big companies with great resources and processes in place find themselves in is that the people who are representing the commercial perspective in those lifecycle teams are frequently very scientifically oriented commercial people who lack new product launch experience, and many of them lack the deep therapeutic area experience to really inform these critical decisions. And what many large companies have done as a workaround to try to compensate here is that they surround these people with committees of more senior executives who are there really to fill in these knowledge gaps. But the problem is even these more senior executives, they often lack the very specific expertise you need for the market you're about to enter. And so I think the potential solution here is to convene sort of advisory panels on the commercial side at this stage, in very much the same way we do on the medical or scientific side. We're very accustomed to bringing together advisory boards of leading thinkers to help us design our phase 2 and phase 3 trials. We don't do the same thing on the commercial side. And I think there are people out there who've launched new products in the exact same category that you're about to enter in the past 5 years. They've got tremendous experience. They've made all of the mistakes you can make. And these are the people you'd ideally like to have weighing in on your target product profile as your phase 2 trial design. And they have the gravitas to sort of be able to shift perspective in those meetings where they tend to be dominated by clinical considerations. And ultimately, I think this has a significant impact on the relative strength of the product that ultimately comes out of the phase 3.
And maybe can I jump in with a question? So why is it that you think that the R&D side of the organizations are more used to having advisory boards and having opinions? Why does that not happen so much on the commercial side? Is it tradition? Is it arrogance? Why is that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think you could say it's arrogance, but I just think that, I talked a bit earlier about the magnitude of improvement that's required to really convince customers to migrate to brands. And it's really, it's really two to four times. I mean, I mentioned that the research suggested that people demand 2 times more compensation to shift brands. Over time, one of the interesting learnings of that research that Richard Thaler had done is that over time, that dynamic actually increases. So if a person has been working for a drug for the past 10 or 15 years, the magnitude of benefit required to convince them to change could be up to 4 times. So I think that many companies don't have an appreciation for just how big that magnitude of change is that's required. And consequently, if you're a commercial person and you're in that life cycle team, which is dominated by, say, more clinically oriented people, I think you're not going to push quite as hard if you think a 20% improvement is going to be enough. If you think it's going to have to be far greater, then you're going to need some support to be in those meetings and pushing people to design a more aggressive trial, perhaps a comparative effectiveness trial versus a trial designed to simply show non-inferiority. And I think it's just a lack of awareness of how much improvement is required. And if we really appreciated that, I think that we would reach out to any resource we had to try to shape that conversation in a way that's going to produce a better outcome.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we could almost say that the arrogance might be on the R&D side.
Yeah, you can say it. Again, I think people are all trying their best. In my experience, I think people are really conscientious. Everybody's trying to do their best. It's just, I think some of these biases and decision traps are hidden. And I think once we expose them and people think about them a bit more, hopefully they'll have more productive conversations. They'll be willing to challenge some existing orthodoxies that have resulted, I think, in suboptimal development programs.
And I actually don't think it's hard to assume that this endowment effect goes both ways, right? So it's not only the patient that needs more to be convinced to switch a drug, it's actually also the internal stakeholders in the company believing more about the drug than there actually is, right? They believe.
A great point. In fact, it does go both ways. That is one of the biggest challenges, really, especially as we talk about forecasting at some point here. It is a huge challenge because a very predictable shift in mindset occurs when companies begin developing a product and tend to become oversensitized to the minor disadvantages advantages of your competitors, and you tend to fall in love with the minor differences that your product is bringing. And over time, your product that you're developing, ultimately, you begin to see that as the new standard of care. And that endowment effect and status quo bias, sort of result in people developing drugs overvaluing them by a factor of 2 to 4 times. And so now you've got this bidirectional distortion that is really dangerous. It makes it virtually impossible to forecast accurately. And it's really one of the most obvious and most significant reasons why we have such a high rate of failure when you've got two different sides looking at things in a completely different way. And we've got to somehow bring them together. And that takes some work, and it takes a bit of a shift in thinking.
That's a nice way of putting it together. And now you mentioned, of course, part of the problem is there's not enough early involvement of commercial in the design of the clinical trials. So now let's say we start to have the involvement. So what strategic considerations in early development should there be that will set us up for a successful launch down the road?
Yeah, I like that question. I think one of the things would be a greater commitment to comparative effectiveness studies in early development. I think if you surveyed, let's say, the top 20 companies in terms of R&D spending, and you ask those R&D organizations, hey, what is your mantra? What guides your decision making? They would probably say some version of, we want to be first in class or best in class. And that makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you have a first in class asset that is at least as good as the standard of care, you're almost definitely going to move that asset ahead in development. However, if you have a product that's the second or third product in a given class, best in class really needs to be the threshold or the benchmark here, because if you simply do a non-inferiority study and bring it to market, the question is, why is somebody going to use that product versus earlier products where they've got more experience? It just makes the commercialization of that asset quite a bit more challenging. So I think in reality, most organizations, even if they say first in class or best in class, they simply mean first in class and whatever else we think we can get over the finish line. And so that's one suggestion I think that could improve our overall output down at the end of the process. The other thing I would say is taking the time to assemble a group, again, of advisors with really relevant commercial experience and bring them on in sort of an advisory capacity. These people are probably working at other companies, so it's not like they don't have day jobs. You can't just hire them, and nor could you afford them that early, but you can certainly hire them as advisors. And if you can get 2 or 3 or 4 of these people in a room together, boy, you're going to get a very clear picture of just how challenging that launch is going to be. You're probably going to have a better ability to convince your clinical counterparts to take some more risk, perhaps, in your phase 2 and phase 3 program.
I think that's a very nice advice. And I think it's almost something in the spirit of our podcast, right? Just start going for lunch with someone in a different part of the industry or a different part of the value chain. But I think that's a great answer. In our previous episodes, we have pretty much focused on the R&D side of things, and we talk a lot about R&D productivity and its various levers, and namely the probabilities of success. And when we had a chat, Jason, you said something that I actually can't forget about, and that is that if you have a low-risk product, right, you have a high probability of success, you now face a high-risk launch. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I can. I think I would describe this as a scenario in which you can either pay me now or you can pay me later. I think when you're developing drugs, and I've been in some of these teams, those teams that are working in early stage development or later stage development, their incentives are driven by the ability to move that asset, through these different milestones and ultimately get the product approved. So you have a drug that demonstrates proof of concept in phase 2. You could do a comparative effectiveness study, but, doing a non-inferiority trial is just, the probability is very high, and you're likely going to hit your goals, and that product's going to move down the path. But ultimately, when it gets to market, now the real challenge begins. And if I take the U.S. market as an example, I think payer and pharmacy benefit manager pressure continues to grow, and they will extract a greater share of the value that you brought to market because they've got the leverage. So they will, in essence, command or demand much higher rebates. In addition to that, they will impose much higher patient co-payments, which ultimately the companies end up subsidizing for patients with private insurance. So ultimately, their profitability goes down quite a bit because essentially it just gets taken from the product by these other players who have more power. And it actually has other sort of downstream implications. One is that, if the company's looking at a product, it gets launched, it's got a relatively low market share, the profitability is lower than they expected. And you're thinking about just how significant should my life cycle investments be. And they're likely to, I'd say, reduce those investments because they don't look like they're going to pay off as well. Now you've diminished the ability of that product to compete in the future. And so it's kind of a downward spiral in a way that these decisions that are taken to maybe reduce the risk during your development plan actually increase the risk as your product comes to market and is facing a sort of a bleaker future.
Yeah. And I mean, this is all part of the ROI of a drug asset, right? So the bleaker future you face in terms of commercialization, that all links to your ROI you get out of that overall development program.
I'll say this, Martin. I think that if we just take the portfolios of our top, 20 pharmaceutical companies in the world, I think it's very likely that they are overvalued for this reason. I think that these low-risk clinical development plans that do not pursue comparative effectiveness studies, they're bringing products to market with a very high level of commercial risk. And one of the things that's interesting but not stated is that, companies have a very systematic way of evaluating the probability of success in moving from preclinical to phase 1, phase 1 to 2, 2 to 3. And so we have very established benchmarks for what those probabilities are. But in those calculations, I've never seen at any company I've been at, I've never seen a calculation for the commercial probability of success. And that's a big problem because you're essentially overestimating the overall value of that asset because you're not taking into consideration one of the most significant risks, which is that, hey, you got this thing through the development process, but now, your biggest risk remains and you've not factored that into your forecast. That's one thing that from a forecasting perspective, I wish companies would consider more. Most of them say, oh, no, once it gets approved, that's a totally different story. We don't need to think about it anymore. But actually we do. And it's one of the reasons I think most portfolios are overvalued.
Yeah, I think that's a very nice insight. And it's not just the probabilities of success. People talk a lot about clinical timelines, but then they don't really talk about launch timelines. And I see companies very often being also very optimistic. It's the moment's approved, but then you see them dragging their feet and it looks painful.
Yeah.
And I have a question. Also talking about the probability of commercial success, I tried to dig into sort of what is the benchmark, and it seems like it's only like maybe with 2 out of 10 drugs that actually become commercially viable and able to recoup their sort of investment costs. Would you put the bar around the same? Maybe?
Yeah, it's actually about 55% of drugs actually recoup their development costs. That's it. So let's call it roughly half. And the other half do not. So it's kind of the pharmaceutical industry follows kind of the power law approach in a way. You need a few big winners to make up for the many losers in your portfolio. And that's the nature of the industry. And I think that's a bargain everybody accepts. But a relatively small number are sort of paying the freight for everybody else.
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe I'm injecting a question here out of curiosity again, but I think also the conversation around, the blockbuster model and so on, is that dead? That now it's maybe more niche busters, but basically it's the blockbusters that make the industry go round, because that's once you hit the blockbuster, they will pay the party for all your losses over all the years. And that makes it break even. Everything else is just basically a loss. I mean, is that too simplistic?
No, I think I agree with what you've said. I think we're still following the blockbuster model in the industry. Our industry follows the very same, I'd say, economics of venture capital. A very small number will really support most of our operations in the end. And so I think what that leads to, I would say, is increasingly companies, when they see they've got an asset that looks very likely to be a blockbuster, they are investing more than ever before. They pull out all of the stops. Their life cycle plans are more aggressive than they ever were in the past. And they tend to front load them because they recognize that the patent is for a limited period of time. So I think companies have got smart in that regard. And now I don't think everybody is caught up to that reality, but there are certain companies, I think AstraZeneca is one that comes to mind, with certain products that I've seen recently where, boy, they've got, in the first 5 years, they've got 6 indications. It's incredible. So I think that's the new reality, is that if that is the case, and we're only going to have a small number of products that pay the freight for the entire company, then we need to make sure that we're maximizing the success of those assets and we're sparing no expense to extract every bit of juice from the orange, so to speak.
Let's now maybe go back to the risks. And I think, as we discussed, it takes quite a bar to convince a patient with a drug. And in your book, you identify insufficient relative advantage as a top reason for launch failures. So how can teams ensure that their drugs offer a clear advantage over the existing products or drugs?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, research is really clear on this, and it suggests that more than half of the variation in an innovation's rate of adoption can be explained by a product's relative advantage. And that's one of the reasons why in the book I refer to it as the greater root cause among equals. And relative advantage can be insufficient in one of 3 ways. The first way is when companies improve products in ways that are just irrelevant to their customers' needs. And an example I point out in the book is a product called Claritin Ready Tabs. Claritin Ready Tabs was a line extension of the blockbuster Claritin allergy franchise. And what made the product different was that it dissolved upon contact with your tongue. It had a nice mint flavor, and it was designed for patients who had difficulty swallowing tablets. But I think what we overlooked, and I was at Schering Plough at that time, was that the original Claritin tablet was so small that it was very easy to swallow either with or without water. And in addition to that, we also had a syrup formulation that had already been approved for younger patients who could not swallow tablets. So there was really no reason for this product to exist. And ultimately, it failed and we sort of deprioritized it. But that was just a simple example of a product that, we're focusing on a point of difference that doesn't really mean much to our customers. The second, I'd say, scenario in which relative advantage is insufficient are situations in which companies improve products in ways that are relevant to their customers' needs, but they just don't improve them enough. And this is by far the most common source of insufficient relative advantage. And in many ways, the most dangerous, because sometimes you can have a clinical outcome from your phase 3 trials that shows that you are statistically superior to one of your primary competitors. But the problem is that it's not particularly clinically meaningful. And so you make bet the farm decisions when you're actually playing with a relatively weak hand of cards. And I think an example of this in recent memory is a product that AstraZeneca launched called Brilinta for acute coronary syndromes. What made this product different was that it was statistically superior to Plavix, which was the standard of care at the time, and a $7 billion a year drug, by the way. It was statistically superior. And so the company was very optimistic about its prospects. The analysts had very high expectations for it. But when you drill down into the individual endpoints, things like myocardial infarction or stroke that were part of the larger endpoint, you found that the improvements on an absolute basis were just 1% or less than 1%. And this simply wasn't enough to convince people to migrate to this brand. And the other factor that also influenced that particular launch was that Plavix was going off patent relatively soon. So when that factor was considered, it made it even less reasonable to ship to this new product when you were going to have an incredibly low cost, high efficacy product. And so ultimately it was a very disappointing launch. So that's probably the most common form of insufficient relative advantage. And the third, I'd say, version or the third scenario in which relative advantage can be insufficient are situations where meaningful improvements in one area of performance are offset by declines in another. And these are frequently, I would say, paradigm-changing products. And one that comes to mind is J&J's Carvykti. Carvykti was a CAR T therapy. These are essentially autologous cell therapies. They're made from a patient's own cells. The product was approved for relapsed refractory multiple myeloma after 4 or more lines of therapy. So these were incredibly sick patients. And what made this product different was that it had a 98% response rate, which was really remarkable in this population. It got immediate use, and it was immediately a very, very well-used drug in late-line treatment. And there's a lot of optimism that this drug would move upstream in therapy and deliver similar benefits for patients. But unfortunately, shortly after it launched, a troubling safety signal soon emerged related to secondary malignancies, particularly blood-based cancers. And the rate was north of 10%, where prior products in this category had rates of secondary malignancies of maybe 2 to 3% over a much longer time period. So the drug was not removed from the market. It was simply relegated to late-line therapy where the risk-benefit ratio could be justified. But this is a common problem for really innovative, pioneering products, sometimes coming from areas like cell and gene therapy, that they bring other, I'd say, disadvantages with them that end up sort of imperiling the product's performance overall. And so if I summarize around relative advantage, I would say, first, companies need to improve products in ways that are relevant to their customers' needs. They need to improve them enough, and those improvements cannot be offset by declines because, as I mentioned earlier, people are really averse to losing benefits that they already possess. They don't want to lose that. So if you're bringing something to market that's successful, you have to sort of match, the existing attributes that a product has and then do better than them on one or more important criteria. So thanks for the opportunity to talk about a little bit about relative advantage.
It's about the meaningful differentiation that meets a certain bar.
Exactly. Being different is not enough. It's got to be different in an important, in a way that's important to decision making.
Can I ask, and sorry for jumping in with another question here. So how do you see if you have a commercial teams out there in pharma organizations, because sometimes they have like a software tool for trading off safety attributes versus efficacy attributes versus convenience attributes. Do you think, is that where they are struggling? So the organizations are not able to really figure out what is more important. And if I trade off and become better on one attribute, let's say efficacy, is that where the pain point is?
Yeah, I think we've historically, when we think about sort of developing a positioning for a product, we tend to look at the attributes that are really readily observable. We look for sort of any deficits on those attributes where our product does better. And then we tend to position our product on those attributes. And the problem is that we don't really know whether those attributes actually cause people to do anything. And sometimes, I'd say clever marketers, ones that are more sophisticated, might say, okay, let's maybe run some regressions where we look at these attributes and then their impact on actual market share. And we see if they're highly correlated. And they say, oh, wow, if they're highly correlated, it must mean that these attributes are actually causing people to prescribe the drug more. And that's just not the case. We all know that correlation doesn't mean causation. So your ultimate goal of your market segmentation process is the discovery of a cause, what causes people to do things, I think you have a much better chance of finding a meaningful basis for differentiation than you do when you simply just go through almost like a laundry list of here are the 15 attributes. Where can we be better than competitors? Let's focus there. And that generally leads into a very undifferentiated product because we're not looking at it the right way.
Yeah, thanks for that answer.
And I mean, now we have been talking about differentiation and relative advantage. So how about timing? And how important is that in a successful drug launch? If our fictional company is facing a competitor that is likely to reach the market first, should it now worry about being late? And is there something it can still do actually to offset some of the impact?
Yeah, it's a good question, Martin. The answer to the question is that it depends, which is a cop out, but it's true. Back in 2014, McKinsey published a very important piece of research that took a look at the value of being first to market. It was a very big project. They analyzed 492 drugs that had at least one competitor, and they conducted a series of analyses. And one of the first analyses was to try to understand whether the market share for first entrants was higher than for second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth entrants. And they took a look at 10 years after the launch of the first entrant. And they just did averages across these, first to markets all the way to sixth to markets. And they found the average market share among first entrants was 40%. Among second entrants, it was 33%. Among third entrants, it was 19%. And then it went down from there in a stepwise fashion. So it did appear, just on first glance, that order of market entry mattered. The second analysis they did was to try to understand how many of those first entrants went on to become market leaders. And you would have expected, based on that first piece of analytical work they did, you would have expected that figure to be high. But what they found was that less than 50% of these first movers or first entrants actually achieved market leadership. And that was really counterintuitive. So McKinsey hypothesized that there may be some other factor or set of factors that can either magnify or erase the benefits of early market entry. And so they looked at criteria like speed in developing new indications and commercialization experience and time to second launch and number of competitors in a given category. I think of some other ones they had in there. Which drug category? You were a specialty drug or primary care? Did you have prior therapeutic area experience? And what was your route of administration? Are you an IV drug or an oral drug? So they looked at 7 different factors, which was interesting. And what they found was speed in developing new indications had the greatest ability to either magnify or erase the benefits of being first to market. The next most important thing was commercialization experience. Are you a big global pharma company that's launched 20 products, or are you a first-time launcher? The next one was time to second market entrant. You really need time to establish your product. And if you have enough time, you've got a much higher rate of success. The fourth one was number of total competitors. If you have 3 or more versus 1 or 2, it has really big implications. And being a specialty drug versus a primary care drug, also big implications. And the 2 that didn't have as much impact, but they were still positive, were things like therapeutic area experience. So still a positive, multiplier, probably added 50% to your performance, but not quite as much, let's say, as speed in developing new indications. So it was really interesting because what it suggested was that if you're a large pharmaceutical company and you're first entrant in a given category, and you've got 3 or more years to establish yourself before the next player, and you've got a very aggressive life cycle management plan where you're going to have at least 1 additional new indication over and above your second entrant in the first 5 years, you are going to be the market leader for quite some time. And it's pretty safe to say that. And so I think what it suggests is it gives you a better understanding of when you're playing with a very strong hand and when you should move all of your chips into the middle of the table and double down. I think in contrast, if you are a first-time launcher and a second entrant is coming in a year and a half later, and it's a big company with big resources, and they're going to have a very aggressive life cycle plan, maybe more aggressive than yours, and maybe they've got therapeutic area experience as well, you really need to be thinking about either raising a lot more money and investing in a much more aggressive plan, or potentially partnering with another company who's large and has therapeutic area experience, because it's going to be a dogfight, and it's very likely that your first mover advantage is going to be erased. So I think this piece of research, and I think we'll probably put some links in the show notes to some really important publications here, but this is one that I think every executive, whether you are a person in clinical development or a person in commercialization, doesn't matter. You really need to understand this because it gives you a much better ability to forecast when you've got a real winner in your hands and when you're playing with a more marginal product. And it will help, I think, to more properly value the pipelines, industry-wide, and really give you a better understanding of when, again, you've got those few products that pay all the bills. You know which ones they are, and you double down on them and you overinvest in them.
Yeah, this has been great and this has been practical. And before we actually move closer to the launch, what are some of the common early mistakes or oversights companies make that can doom launch from the start? Are there any that we didn't particularly cover that would still be notable at this point?
Yeah, I think there's a few that are just coming to mind. This list, certainly this will not be exhaustive, but there's a few scenarios I think that companies should try to avoid or just be very aware of when they find themselves in these situations. One is when companies want to enter a new therapeutic area, but they're doing so with a product that's a Me Too product, or in some cases, even a lesser than Me Too product. And this is a very dangerous situation to be in because there is value in therapeutic area experience. And I've been a part of a number of companies that have tried to break into new therapeutic areas. It's just extremely hard. You don't know the customers. You don't have a great deal of experience and understanding of the competitive situation. And as a result, these companies tend to underperform. And so I think the companies that understand this and observe this dynamic, they tend to make sure their products are so good when they're entering a new therapeutic area that they can exceed with average or below average execution because that's likely what they're going to get. And there's a handful of products over the years come to mind here. I think when Park Davis launched Lipitor, it was their first foray into cardiovascular medicine. And Park Davis was no powerhouse company from a commercial perspective, but the product succeeded because, it was just that good. I think Lilly, when they launched Prozac, was entering a new therapeutic area. They were not in psychiatric medicine. Great product, and they killed it. And then ultimately, another example is Astra, before they became AstraZeneca, launched Prilosec into the GI space, and they had a tremendous success with that. And these products were so good that really no amount of marketing malpractice could really derail them. So I think entering a new therapeutic area is very challenging and should be approached with great hesitation unless you've got a product that's good enough. Another sort of scenario I think that's one to avoid if you can is paradigm-changing products. These products are sexy, they're exciting. I think cell and gene therapies are an example, right? And really the first autologous cell therapy is a product called Provenge that I know very well because I worked with it at a point in time. But Provenge was a very promising product for metastatic prostate cancer. And it brought some unique benefits. It extended, overall survival by 4.5 months in some pretty sick patients. So it was very exciting, but it brought along some baggage that really ended up really decreasing, I'd say, the demand for the product. And among those things, first and foremost, it had a very high administrative burden. So, autologous cell therapies, they're made from a patient's own cells. So they had to, in 3 separate installments, they had to have patients sit in a chair, take their white blood cells out of their body for 4 hours. They'd expose those cells to the antigen that is on the surface of prostate cancer cells so it recognizes them. And they put those cells back into the patient and it mounts a very strong immune response. And the entire process of preparing that patient can take 1.5 to 2 months to get all of those treatments in. And so it takes time to get started. These patients are sick. Sometimes they're in a very precarious situation. We can't afford to wait 1.5 to 2 months. In addition, the product was a $100,000 drug, roughly, back in 2010, and those payments had to be made up front before the benefits of the drug were known. So payers hated that. And in addition, it was a buy and bill product. So offices had to purchase this big, costly product and then file it for reimbursement. And if they didn't get reimbursement for some reason, it could bankrupt a practice. There were other issues as well related to a very narrow sort of target patient population and no sort of surrogate endpoints to show that the drug was working. But ultimately, the drug became a sort of a niche product, but people had expected it to become really a standard of care. And I think, paradigm changing products, because they usually bring some unique features that are different from the existing standard that people don't like. Again, they don't want to give up any benefits they currently possess. If they're using oral drugs or they're using IVs, they don't want something that makes life a lot more difficult. So paradigm changing products, if someone invites me to launch a new paradigm-changing product, I'm going to decline that. I'm going to decline that job. The other one that comes to mind is situations when companies are approaching categories with a very strong standard of care that is largely genericized. And there's two categories that come to mind. Cardiovascular and antibiotic categories are impacted by this. They tend to have a lower rate of commercial success than, let's say, hematology or oncology because of this. And they're incredibly strong standards of care. If you want to break into, to the stack, so to speak, you need a product with incredible value. I mean, really incredible value. The bar is so high. People are so spoiled by tremendous products that are very cheap that these are categories that need to be approached with hesitation and with caution.
Can I ask you mentioned Lipitor, and that's an example that often comes up in the meeting rooms when, let's say, the R&D folks and the commercial folks are fighting whether you need to be first to market or it's okay to be a late entrant. And then the R&D folks will say, yeah, but just think about Lipitor. They were fifth to market and just look how successful that was. So what would you say in that meeting room if that came up as an argument for being late to market or a late entrant?
It's a great point. I think that Lipitor was a product that was very good. I think there's a few things that are true about that example. I think one is that it was the LDL cholesterol lowering agents. It was still relatively early in the, let's say, the lifespan of that category when Lipitor launched. Mevacor was the first, followed by Zocor, and then comes, Pravachol was in there too, but it was a weaker product. So Lipitor comes in, it's relatively early, everybody is patent protected. And so people are more willing to accept, minor differences. Lipitor was clearly better. It outperformed Pravachol in clinical studies and other products in the category. So it really was the best, but these were relatively marginal advantages. I think what really helped probably Lipitor the most is when Pfizer purchased Parke-Davis. Pfizer was a powerhouse in cardiovascular medicine. It's where I began my career and walked into offices with tremendous swagger because we had produced, $3 or $4 billion products already. There's no question Pfizer was arguably the number one company in cardiovascular medicine and a big company to boot. And so it came in and really invested tremendous amounts of money in every possible way. So I think that was a situation where they caught up because they did in fact have a better product and that category was still developing. And I think in the early days of a category, I think there's more tendency to sort of to shift brands for maybe a slightly smaller benefit. Then you will find later in the life cycle of that category, like when I mentioned Brilinta earlier and Plavix is about to go off patent, it's the standard in that category. And you're like, do I really want to shift to Brilinta, which is 1% better when I'm going to get a generic product that every payer is going to want me to write? And in the other example, you've got Zocor and Lipitor going head to head. They're maybe 3 or 4 years into the life cycle of that category, and you're looking for the best product as a doctor, period. And so the benefits, I think, they resonated a little more. And I think just the sheer marketing muscle that Pfizer brought to bear had probably a disproportionate effect in that particular example. But this is one of the reasons why, when we think about order of market entry, less than half of first entrants ultimately become market leaders because you have to keep investing in a product over time. And I think the life cycle plan that Pfizer had was just overwhelmed the other products in that category. And that can turn the tables in a category when one player in that category really outperforms the other in their life cycle management.
I almost feel like this Lipitor example wrapped up all the lessons we have learned in this section so far.
But it did touch on a few. Yeah.
This is the end of the first part of our 2-part episode.
Stay tuned for part 2, where we continue by moving closer to the actual launch. And don't worry, you don't have to wait 2 weeks for this episode. It will follow closely after.
Thank you for listening and see you back in part 2.